Hi, I'm Dr. Ehsan Garajataki, clinical psychologist with Therapy Cable. And today we will be talking about the cluster B diagnosis of personality disorders, which is categorized under DSM within the three clusters of personality disorders. In another video, we talked about cluster A. Today, the cluster B focuses on four personality disorders: antisocial personality disorder, borderline personality disorder, histrionic personality disorder, and narcissistic personality disorder. We have another video that thoroughly goes through the symptoms, etiology, and treatment of borderline personality disorder, so I will only summarize very quickly about borderline and then move on to a more in-depth conversation about antisocial and histrionic as well as narcissistic. So, first of all, I want to make the distinction that DSM 5 really describes these four personality disorders or diagnoses under the cluster B based on their presentation, not based on their root cause or etiology. So, in other words, these four personality disorders have different causes that we will go through today in this video. However, the way the cluster B has categorized them is not based on those causes. It's based on how these disorders present themselves if you encounter them. So, in other words, if you saw a person who has antisocial personality or narcissistic or borderline or histrionic traits, features, tendencies, how would you detect it? How would you see it? How would you know that this person has this problem? That's what we are talking about, the presentation. So the core theme of the presentation among all these four diagnoses is something called emotional, erratic, dramatic theme. So because generally the behavioral habits, the interactions with other people that these individuals engage in are highly emotional, are highly dramatic in nature. The way they express themselves emotionally, the way they talk, the way they perceive other people's actions, interactions, intentions, and respond are usually tainted and defined by emotionality. So let's go through them and kind of differentiate between them. So first of all, let's start with antisocial. So antisocial is not really what it sounds like, because generally antisocial would mean people who don't like the society, don't want to be close to society, want to be away from the society, and that's not meant here. So antisocial, in other words, actually what is meant by it is anti-authority, anti-rule, anti-norm. However, it has been called over the many years, it has been called antisocial. So, but going to the correct understanding or meaning of it, let's look at that: anti-rule, anti-norm, anti-authority. It emerges, the real meaning behind it, or real problem, is that the person who is characterized with antisocial behavior basically doesn't like rules. They don't like norms and regulations, and they revolt, rebel, and object authority. People who have some kind of a power and authority over them. So the core issue that we are dealing with here is that generally most people kind of abide by rules, norms, regulations that are set in society. They quickly understand it, they learn how to deal with it, sometimes go around it, sometimes bend those in their favor, but they generally get along with the society, with the societal norms. And they don't get in trouble, and they don't rebel vehemently against it. In contrast, people who have antisocial tendencies, they disregard all the societal norms. They don't mind getting in trouble, if you will. They even get some gratification and satisfaction from defying authority, standing up to authority, and even breaking authority. At times, there may be a little bit of a desire to take the whole system apart and destroy it. And that's also the word destroying brings me to one of the symptoms and signs that we see within the behavior of antisocial, which is usually breaking rules, norms, destroying property, destroying things that they don't like, theft, manipulation, deceit, cheating, and even destroying relationships. They come to a point where relationships and people really don't matter to them anymore. They become objects, they become tools for them to use in order to get to the goals that they have. And again, some kind of a gratification, self-gratification, getting their needs met, a very selfish, self-centered, and destructive, and kind of a overbearing, overruling type of a stance that they take in life. And as a result, ultimately what we see is that they do get in trouble, they do get punished, they do end up in jails and prisons, and they engage in criminal behavior ultimately. Now, there are two variations of the antisocial behavior that I would like to also bring up. One is conduct disorder. So that's also important to understand, because antisocial, if you were wondering, like, well, when does it surface? Is it like somebody just wakes up in their any time, like maybe they're in their 20s, 30s, 60s, and suddenly they become antisocial? And that's not the case. It's not like something that develops over time. That's how it relates to the idea of conduct disorder, because basically what we see is that these tendencies to ignore authority and defy authority and destroy properties or even hurt people, animals, to the point of perhaps even torturing them, this develops early on. We see these types of tendencies develop in more or less childhood, if you will, very likely around early adolescence. So it could even, you could see it probably at right around the age of maybe 5, 6, very early signs. If you see kids play and they tend to just want to get their way and ignore the well-being or needs or interests of others. Now, that can be mitigated, it can be directed, and that can go away. But then if it doesn't, and the child continues kind of getting their way and defying norms and rules, and the parents are not really engaging a good, productive, and effective parenting style, and also the environment feeds into this dynamic, then that child can grow up, and in their early teens, they can get in some kind of a peer pressure, maybe even bullying, maybe even just too much of a permissive parenting style, where they learn how to manipulate people, they learn how to get the things they want and overrule authority, stand up to authority, ignore directions, directives, commands, regulations. And again, it becomes a almost self-perpetuating, self-reinforcing cycle where they get their needs met and defy authority, defy rules and norms, and then start not really minding getting in trouble, including, for instance, truancy. They may stay away from classes and the school environment. They may get into association with the wrong crowds, maybe even associating with some gangs, maybe even getting involved with drug use, etc. And all kinds of more or less experimental things that they are getting involved with, but all into more or less a destructive pattern, destructive direction. And by the time they're late teens, there is this tendency in the DSM, at least DSM diagnosis, to draw a line about 18 years of age. So if we observe teenagers engage in this conduct, and that's why it's called a conduct disorder, which also in its early form, it's more categorized as what they call oppositional defiant disorder. So it develops from this, anti-rule, anti-authority, I'm going to get away with whatever I want in early ages, and turns into this oppositional defiant disorder, if you will, if it is extreme, and then into a solid conduct disorder where the person is just continually engaging in this type of a anti-authority, anti-rule behavior until they hit 18. Once they hit 18, then we are more comfortable, if you will, more confident with diagnosing antisocial personality disorder, because right around the age of, if you will, majority, 18, 19, 20, that's where we psychologically believe that a person's personality has already fully formed. Up until age of 18, it's hard to tell because there are lots of opportunities for them to change their personality. So it's kind of the progression from anti-authority, anti-rule, into oppositional defiant disorder, conduct disorder, antisocial disorder. And then the variation that I also wanted to bring up is something called psychopathic, or sociopathic disorder. That is an area that is hardly researched as rigorously as the other areas, and it's not really categorized in the DSM. It's not part of these clusters, and it's not part of a solid diagnosis, but generally in the field of psychology, we know of sociopathic and psychopathic behaviors. We know of some tendencies, and it's interesting that some of those sociopathic and psychopathic behaviors can actually go undetected and they exist under the radar for many, many years until it's more or less too late, to a point where once the person with this disorder is caught, there has been quite a lot of damage done, such as murder, embezzlement, destruction of some kind of rules or norms or systems, even nationwide or worldwide systems. One of the examples that come to mind are great manipulators in the history. For instance, generally there is a case of Bernie Madoff, a billionaire financier who is known to have embezzled billions of dollars during the 2000, for actually over a period of 50 years, but ending in 2008, 2009, where for 50 years all his scam was undetected because he generally didn't get in trouble. He didn't defy rules blatantly to a point of blatantly destroying people's property or wealth, etc., up until a time where the entire scheme of embezzlement that ultimately ended in destroying people's wealth, including putting hundreds of thousands of people out of jobs, costing their pensions, etc., and even leading to some people suicide and destruction of families, etc., came to the surface after he was indicted, after he was put in prison, after lawsuits had been filed, and after all these witnesses came forth to claim the reward, if you will, to the destruction that had been done to their families and to their wealth. So that's just one example. There are hundreds of other examples, again, where people can also defy rules and norms of the society, including embezzling, including manipulating, cheating, defying all kinds of norms and societal, moral, ethical norms and rules, and some of them also legal, and go undetected. That can also happen. So this was just a very brief summary, really, about antisocial category, with some outliers on the sides. Let's move on to the next category, which is borderline personality disorder. Borderline personality disorder, very summarily formed here and described, has to do with more or less a person's difficulty with emotional regulation around relationship issues, but specifically within the relationships that they experience, there is something important, an issue or a concept that we call attachment and bonding. And within that concept of developing that bond to another person, there's always this threat that this bond may not happen, or this may be broken. The other person may change their mind, and they may leave the relationship. So the threat of rejection, the threat of abandonment, the threat of a dissolution of this bond always exists. Now, generally, people may go about it with all kinds of strategies that they may have internally. Let's say they're tapping into their own resources and not worrying much about it, or being good negotiators or communicators, being able to resolve these issues before they get out of hand. But people with borderline personality disorder, or even traits or features, they have a hard time doing so. So they tend to really be deficient in their regulation of their feelings around this threat and this idea that my partner may leave me, or this relationship may come to an end, this may not last, or I may be rejected, or my way of being and thinking and my likes and dislikes may be rejected by my partner. So that's the whole core issue. Now, what they do is, because there is another component which is very much an irrational and black and white thinking, all or none thinking, a pattern of cognitive reasoning that exists at the same time, which really goes hand in hand with that emotional dysregulation. They're kind of two sides of the same coin. They tend to reinforce each other, meaning if there is a sign that the partner of a person is not lenient to give in to a certain need or demand that this person has, they may immediately engage their all or none thinking, black and white thinking, and fear the worst, and think that the entire relationship is useless and worthless, and then therefore again react too emotionally and too strongly to their partner. For instance, maybe even preemptively leave the relationship, maybe even threaten the partner with leaving the relationship as a means to protecting themselves, or kind of sending a signal that there is something wrong, but they're kind of going to the extreme, like they go from 0 to 60 in a second. And that is ultimately observed in their behavior, in their expression of their feelings, in the way that they are getting extremely angry, extremely emotional, extremely agitated and frustrated, and basically engage in this impulsive, momentary behaviors of, for instance, leaving, the room, and not wanting to talk, shutting down, kind of leaving the conversation, or even getting highly agitated and even verbally or physically abusive. So that's the part that ties into that presentation, why they belong into this cluster B, because of this highly agitated presentation. Just want to backtrack a little bit before we go forward, because I wanted to draw a little bit of similarity why antisocial and borderline belong to the same category. Because again, with antisocial, you get a lot of these overtly destructive behaviors. People who have antisocial tendencies, they don't care about others. They are in the face, in your face basically. They become belligerent. They become quite condescending and demeaning. And then you go to borderline, they become emotional, impulsive, angry, agitated, again, also in your face, very much belligerent at times. And then you have the next category, histrionic, and as well as narcissistic, that also become very much expressive with their feelings and emotions, that either are designed to evoke a certain emotion in the partner, such as histrionic wanting to, let's say, seduce the other person or attract the other person or become the center of their attention, or with narcissistic wanting to almost exert control over the other party. So all of those have a commonality in terms of their intensity of their emotional expression and experience. Therefore, that they have been clustered into this cluster B, around the theme of erratic, dramatic, emotional presentation. So now, moving on with histrionic, the issue with histrionic, what we see is generally that there is a desire to be in the center of attention, to influence the people around them, to the point that they can get their focus, attention, their interest, their buy-in, if you will, that other people invest their time and energy in this person with the histrionic personality. So therefore, a lot of their, if you will, communication and approach toward others is characterized, is embedded with lots of emotionality, expressing themselves in a very highly emotional way, using mostly words that are aligned with feelings and emotions, and also exaggerating to a point, becoming very flamboyant, again seductive. And also, it's not just the way they present themselves verbally, but also in terms of their demeanors and dress code, and just kind of the presence in the moment. They can be very they dress up very impressively at times, again, like I mentioned, seductively, to a point of influencing the other person with their body language, with their body presentation, with their the way they are relating to the other person, perhaps sensually and sexually. So they use that aspect of a person's, if you will, character and personality to exert influence and to draw the other party toward themselves. So it's that combination of a very seductive, sexual, sensual, in the moment, a type of experience. It can include a lot of facial expression, eye contact, almost intrusive, if you will, and to an extent overbearing and invasive, but also using extremely emotional words and feelings to express themselves. However, interestingly, despite all this high emotionality and connection via their feelings with the other person, there is some shallowness to them. There is a little bit of, if you will, vagueness. So there's no depth to it. There's no real truth and genuine expression in it. A person who spends time with a histrionic over time learns that, all of this is really for show. It's mostly to just keep me interested, but nothing much beyond that. There is no depth, and you know that when you interact with a person, whether or not you can connect with them on a much deeper level, get to a more meaningful type of a bond and connection and kind of an empathic understanding of one another, or it's kind of fleeting and flies by. It's like after a while you have heard a lot of these feelings, emotions, and kind of changes the subject. It becomes vague. There is no detail to it. So ultimately, what we see from histrionic personality is they're using all this, emotional presentation, dramatic interrelatedness with others, again, in order to be important, feel wanted, not feel rejected, feel some kind of a value and appreciation and power and admiration. Um, Now, let's move on to narcissistic, which is also kind of similar, if you will, in their nature in terms of etiology, I would say, because also narcissistic is really based on the desire of gaining power in a relationship. So, first of all, one of the core brute, if you will, causes of narcissism is really a sense of powerfulness. Now, I'm not going to get into much of a psychodynamic explanation of it. There's a lot of research in the psychoanalytic field, self-psychology, object relations, and other branches of psychodynamic psychology that explains a lot of very detailed stages of the progression, really, or development of narcissistic personality development. But I can summarize it into more or less that identity of the person having developed to a point where they see themselves very powerful, highly valuable, highly more or less admirable. They think of themselves quite highly. They put themselves on the pedestal, and they would like to get that from their environment. So it's a desire of positioning themselves, seeing themselves as powerful and in power, and also wanting to have that reinforced and reiterated and validated by their environment, which means people around them. So family members, spouses, kids, parents, etc. Again, there's a sense of being center of attention. However, it's more intellectual. It's more, if you will, abstract. It's more in terms of a sense of knowledge about themselves versus the histrionic, where it is evident in the way they dress up, the way they seduce people, the way they emotionally talk to others, the way they almost on a minute to minute, second to second basis exert influence and include a lot of these feelings and emotions and affective aspect of the relationship. The narcissistic may not do that. However, intellectually, cognitively, in terms of their core belief system, they see themselves at a higher level than everybody else. They admire themselves. They may not express it. They may not become very emotional about it. They may not emphasize and kind of stress the need to be admired in the moment, but in general, in terms of their way of reasoning, negotiating, strategizing, expressing their needs over a longer period of time, responding to their partners and to family members, friends, co-workers, etc. You see this hubris, you see this omnipotence about them, you see this sense of I'm better than everybody else, I'm better than you. There is another part to it too, and you would think, so basically people with narcissistic personality disorder walk around always on cloud nine and think they're better than others. But that's really not the case. The downside to all these, let's say, elevated sense of self-worth is a very dark void that they also feel about themselves that's very secretive. They don't display that, they don't show it, they don't let anybody know, and they fear actually that that acknowledgement. Like if they would be regarded as normal, where let's say if it is a scale of completely unlikable, undesirable, worthless, to a normal person, to highly admirable, admired, valuable person, they don't have this bottom. If there is any indication that someone regards them as a normal, mediocre person, the bottom gives out for them and they fall all the way into that void. They can't stand this type of a reaction from other people that, well, I'm just like everybody else. They can't stand that. They have to be on that pedestal. So if they're not on that the pedestal, they drop all the way down to into the depth of that abyss of basically worthlessness and complete opposite of omnipotence. So absolute lack of power and value and worth, and that is extremely devastating to them, to the point that they cannot stand normal reactions or normal responses. They just cannot stand that, and they therefore strive and manipulate the relationship to always remain at this high pedestal. So that's very difficult to maintain, and over time this kind of strategy really reveals itself. It becomes transparent. Other people in their lives, they notice that they're more or less just objects and tools in this gimmick and this strategy of self-admiration for narcissistic people, and they suffer, or they leave, or they become abused. And a lot of times you see this type of abusive relationships, for instance, between someone who tends to have dependent personality disorder because they don't want to make decisions for themselves, and they don't believe much in themselves, and they also are risk averse, and that nicely fits into the game plan of a narcissism who has is not risk averse, is risk prone, loves to make decisions all day, all night, prides themselves in making the best decisions and having all the power and having all the authority, etc. So they kind of find each other, if you will. But the unfortunate part is that it becomes a very abusive relationship, a codependent relationship. So to summarize, all these four personality disorders, again, antisocial, borderline, histrionic, and narcissistic personality, they have different etiologies, different core issues, different desires, different solutions too. And however, they've been categorized in cluster B around their presentation. That is very dramatic, the way they engage with people and express themselves. Now, the solutions are quite different. They will create a couple of videos talking about the solutions, how to deal with these personality disorders, as each one of them really deserve their own time. And I invite you to watch some of the other videos that we have created, especially about cluster A, and a thorough explanation about borderline personality, and also leave us comments. We would love to hear from you about what you think about this video, how we can improve, if you would like to hear other topics, if you would like to hear other explanations. And please leave a comment, email us, or let us know otherwise via our website by contacting us, and look for our other videos as well. Thank you very much, and have a nice day.